I had played Zelda games prior for many years, including Zelda games that were before my time. By now I've tried just about all of them. From Wind Waker to Majora's Mask to a bit of Zelda 2 and the original Zelda, even a bit of the two horrendous CDI side-scroller Zeldas. However, none of them are quite like this. Being a fan of a variety of Zelda games, I was expecting a pretty good game, but I was wrong. I'm gonna tell you exactly what I mean by that in this review of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. So the first thing to be said about Zelda Breath of the Wild is that it's almost completely open world. You need to get through 4 initial shrines, acquiring powers along the way and getting the glider, but after that the world's 100% opened up. You can even take on the final boss if you're in a hurry to die. Another few things to separate it from other Zelda games is the way it handles inventory. Unlike other Zelda games, you don't permanently acquire new weapons and items. Instead, your permanent acquisition is in the form of Sheikah runes, and your weapons are all temporary grabs. Take too long to break. What this means is that the emphasis is a lot less on finding keeper weapons and scavenging everything you can find instead. This makes near the beginning of the game particularly nail-biting, as you're essentially just picking up whatever you can find. If I'm being honest, I'm a little torn on this. On one hand, it can actually make you afraid to use your more powerful weapons just in case, but on the other hand, I can understand the idea that it's supposed to get you to treat weapons as disposable. Thankfully, finding new weapons isn't especially hard, as they're found all over the overworld. If you find a particularly powerful one, like a large flame sword I found near Central Hyrule, keep a note of it because it'll appear every so often. The reason why they reappear is because the game has events called the Blood Moon, wherein enemies you killed are resurrected. Of course, that's just what the game tells you. Essentially, it also removes loose items off the ground you dropped and restores items you grabbed, including those weapons. Basically, it's the game's way of saving memory by wiping the slate clean and resetting the overworld. It actually makes me think of the PS3 version of Skyrim that had an infamous problem of becoming bloated to the point of horribly lagging. It's quite a clever way of preventing a similar issue, making it lighter on the RAM among other things. On the subject of limited durability, shields are likewise breakable, and with certain enemies like Guardians, you can actually parry their attack. Essentially, if they fire a charged laser shot, you can potentially parry, and once you get the timing down, it's pretty satisfying. Perfect parries won't degrade the shield either, but messing up the timing can be very detrimental, so be careful. You can also jump and surf on a shield down hills and the like, but that actually degrades the durability too, so watch it. One nice function is that you can actually mark stamps on your map to keep track of the aforementioned weapons around the world, or even where certain enemies are for farming items off of. Now, I glossed over the glider before, but it essentially lets you float down anytime you want. You just jump off the side of something and pop it out. It's a very handy way to travel. Be careful though, you have a finite amount of stamina before you can no longer glide. Thankfully though, the game will mercifully let you pop it out at least once briefly when you're too low on stamina, which can prevent a fatal fall if used properly. On the subject of stamina, that's actually something the game retains from Skyward Sword. Running, gliding, climbing, spin attacking, swimming, and mid-air slow-motion bow aiming are all tied to this bar. While not nearly as vital as Soulsborne, you still don't want to neglect it, especially when traversing. Along with hearts, you can actually upgrade this by collecting 4 orbs from the various shrines all around the overworld and giving them to certain statues. You get to choose to upgrade stamina or hearts for every 4. Don't worry, there's also a certain statue of devious origins that allows you to trade stamina for hearts by selling one and then buying the other. For obvious reasons, you can only buy back the amount you actually sold, so you can't just get a lot of rupees and max everything out off the bat. On the subject of climbing, this is a great time to delve into the game's strongest aspect by far. Apart from certain situations like inside shrines and divine beasts and the like, you can climb just about everywhere. This is honestly what endeared me to the game more than anything else. Since just about every surface in the overworld is traversable, this gives you a much greater sense of exploration than any other open world game I've played. Climbing the highest surface you possibly can and gliding down is a very legitimate way of getting to new places you haven't before. Of course, if you want to go exploring, you're best served hunting down those aforementioned shrines. Essentially miniature challenges of all types. They not only give you these orbs for stamina and hearts, but activating one outside creates a fast travel point. I'd best compare it to Dark Souls, since like that, you have to actually activate the fast travel point. It doesn't activate automatically just by going near an important location. There are also towers in the game, and they very much serve a similar purpose as some Ubisoft games. You're not required to use them while the world is unlocked, but it does update your map on the surrounding region, and you can also use them as fast travel points. Given they're so tall and you can glide off them, it's very handy. Interestingly though, not all towers are equal. Some of them are downright challenges to circumvent, like getting around blight corruption or melting ice built up around the base. It's always satisfying when you activate one though. Of course, your glider isn't your only reliable means, as you have 4 Sheikah Slate abilities you're required to unlock in the game's starting shrines in the form of runes. These initial runes you get are Remote Bombs, Cryonosis, Magnesis, and Stasis. You can also gain a camera rune by following the story. These runes are used in a wide variety of ways, and the game definitely encourages you to experiment. Perhaps the most humble is the Remote Bomb, very handy for detonation. Unlike the physical bombs of previous Zelda games, this one regenerates after 6 seconds, allowing for infinite use. They come in cube and sphere forms, allowing you to either keep it rigidly in place or allow you to roll them along surfaces. This is not only vital for certain types of puzzles, but makes them invaluable as a method of combat. You can even drop bombs behind you and detonate as you're running. Get them into the right position and they will serve you well. You can upgrade them to double the amount of damage and half the cooldown time. Cryonosis is, of course, your ice ability. Of course, you can't just use it anywhere you want. You need a body of water first. Even shallow, puddle-deep water will work, and it shoots out a block of ice. You're able to swim, but you have until your stamina bar depletes before you drown and reappear on dry land. This is where Cryonosis comes in, allowing you to travel across bodies of water more easily since you can just chill out on one. You get 3 blocks to work with additional ones breaking prior ones. Since you can also make sideways blocks of ice on waterfalls and the like, it obviously factors into certain puzzles too. You can also choose to break blocks at your leisure, and there's at least 2 encounters where you can actually crush enemy ice using this. Magnesis is fairly simple, it's your magnet power. How these friggin' magnets work is anyone's guess, but any big metal object becomes a mere feather in your almighty hands as you can lift large slabs, blocks, balls, and the like. Naturally, this is primarily for puzzles, and you can also use it to drop heavy objects on top of some sap's head. Very simple, but also very effective. Once you get the hang of how it controls, what with pushing and pulling and whatnot, it's quite addictive. You can also use it to fish out treasure chests that are sometimes found underwater. Very handy since you unfortunately have no way of diving down. And I've saved the best for last of the initial 4, the almighty Stasis. The best way I can describe it is that it's like a reverse Waldo, where whatever you select becomes frozen in time.
Well, actually, if we're going with JoJo jokes, it's probably more like the Stan Craft work. It even has the very useful aspect where force applied to the object is stacked so that once it wears out, it's all applied at once.
This can be used to easily fling very heavy objects through the air. You'll really want to get the upgrade for this because it allows you to freeze enemies. Only for a very short window though, so use wisely. It has a 10-second cooldown, but unfreezing an object reduces this. It's a very powerful little tool if you use it properly. Now for the camera rune. It may seem like a novelty, but it actually serves some very powerful purposes. Initially, it stores objects and characters into essentially an encyclopedia, handy for brushing up on information. The upgrade, however, is insanely good. By default, your Sheikah Slate comes with the ability to hone in on shrines with an accompanying beep signifying how close it is. With this handy upgrade, you can take anything in that encyclopedia and hone in on that instead. If you want to hunt for valuable ore to sell or just find some treasure chests, this is going to be your tool of the trade. Definitely upgrade it as soon as you can, you'll be glad you did. I probably used it more than any other rune just with the potential to make a lot of money to buy equipment with. And speaking of upgrades, I think it's time to move on to armor. Unlike previous games, Link's identifiable clothing in this game is a baby blue tunic rather than green. It seems to serve as a symbol of the royal family since the 4 champions of the game and Zelda herself wear blue too. However, this isn't expected to be your primary clothes throughout the entire game. Much like a more traditional RPG, you can gain clothes, and Link actually starts out in his underwear to gain the champion's blue tunic a bit later on. Unlike weapons, armor thankfully doesn't degrade. Which is good, that Flamebreaker armor really costs a pretty rupee if you want heat resistance. Of course, that brings us into passive bonuses that some armor has, such as heat resistance or the Zora armor allowing you to swim up waterfalls. There are great fairies throughout the game whom, after paying them a lump sum of rupees to somehow restore their powers, can upgrade your armor pieces with the right materials. However many great fairies in the world you've saved dictates how many times you can upgrade each piece. A lot of the sets actually give you set bonuses if you're wearing every piece and have upgraded them, like the Zora armor reducing stamina consumption while swimming. Sadly though, unlike previous games, Zora armor doesn't allow you to go underwater, nor will it prevent you from drowning if you run out of stamina. I suppose it makes somewhat sense, being an open world and all. On the subject of materials, you can gain materials from killing enemies, and certain types have a chance to drop certain materials. This is important not only for upgrading armor, but for making elixirs and certain foods. This brings us into cooking, another semi-unique system for this game. While Wind Waker allowed you to turn in jelly to get potions, Breath of the Wild allows you to cook various recipes anywhere there's an available cooking pot. Generally speaking, cooking food items increases their properties and brings out certain properties like peppers being able to give you cold resistance, while elixirs involve mixing with small animals and monster parts. If you cook the wrong kind of stuff, you might get dubious food that's hilariously pixel-censored, probably implying it quite literally looks like crap. The real prizes are hearty foods, as when eaten while cooked, they overheal, providing temporary hearts above your maximum. Like with health, certain foods can restore your stamina, and enduring foods overfill the stamina in the same way. Since you see gains immediately during the pause menu, it's definitely worth your while to load up on as many cooked items as your inventory will hold. You can even catch up to 4 fairies found near fairy fountains, and they'll revive you when fatally wounded as in previous games. Along with Mipha's Grace, this can give you a buffer against death. And that transitions us into the Divine Beasts. There are 4 of them in the game, previously held by the 4 champions, but they were killed, having the beasts turned against them, and their souls have been trapped inside for 100 years. They serve as the closest things to traditional Zelda dungeons, although you still don't get midway items to use against the boss or anything. Instead, you find an initial terminal to turn on the beast and have some control over it to try to find your way around. Rotate bits of the beast around to get to all the terminals, and you have to fight one of the blights. These can range in difficulty. I definitely recommend doing Vandabor's last, because Thunder Blight Ganon is a speedy little spawn from hell and easily the hardest among them. Defeating one of the Divine Beasts will gain you not only that Divine Beast freed in a heart container, but each champion will grant you rechargeable abilities to make it a little easier for your adventure. As previously mentioned, Mipha's Grace will automatically revive you when you run out of health and initially takes 24 minutes to recharge. Durok's Protection grants 3 free barriers from attacks and automatic parries and takes 18 minutes to recharge initially. Urbosa's Fury, activated by charging up your sword, does a powerful lightning attack up to 3 times before needing 12 minutes initially to recharge. Finally, Rivali's Gale creates an updraft for your glider up to 3 times before needing to be recharged 6 minutes initially. That one is perhaps the least direct for combat, but obviously quite handy for exploring. I say initially because of the Champion's Ballad DLC, you can reface the Blights under special conditions. Beating each one reduces the recharge time and the power associated with it to 1/3 of what it previously was, and if you can beat all challenges with it, Link gets his own Divine Beast. Unlike the others though, it isn't some giant beast, but I think you'll agree it's a lot cooler. Link actually gets a motorcycle, although you need materials like apples to keep it fueled every so often. It becomes a rune, so you can actually summon it anytime you want, handy if it falls over a cliff or something. It's quite fast, even compared to the horses. Of course, this is where I get to the horses. There are horses all throughout the game that you can get in a variety of ways. Mostly you have to sneak up to one and sedate it with your stamina bar, but I actually found mine with an enemy riding it. After killing said enemy, the horse was essentially mine. There are stables all throughout for you to register your horse in, acting as essentially teleportation for your horse. If that's not enough, one form of DLC allows you to get ancient armor, which I quickly made use of. With it, you can teleport your horse to you with a whistle that before that just has the horse head towards you if you're close enough. You can even find Ganondorf's horse from Ocarina of Time, although be prepared to have some mighty stamina first. This game is so deep with so much to do that I can't possibly get through everything like stealth, so I'll just touch upon shrines. There's a whopping 120 shrines in the game, ranging from just finding the shrine and being rewarded to being almost like mini dungeons where you have to solve multiple puzzles in. You get a classic style green hero's tunic for doing all of them, but I didn't want to be bothered at the time, so I just gave myself a different type of green tunic you get from one of the amiibos. I just wanted to look fittingly heroic with the classic green tunic, master sword, and Hylian shield. If there are shrines I couldn't stand though, it's the gyro-controlled shrines. Specifically ones where you have to guide one or more balls into position. I applaud your enthusiasm and experimentation, Nintendo, but that was just annoying. If I had to pick one as the most memorable though, it's definitely the island one. You temporarily lose all your items and armor and have to make do survivor style. Of course, you get to keep your champion and rune powers. It actually reminds me of a moment in Bioshock where you have to turn in your guns, but obviously keep plasmids. Naturally, you're rewarded on the spot when you make it into the shrine as well as getting your stuff back, since getting the balls in the slots to open the shrine is the big challenge. From all the armor you can get with different effects to the champion powers and numerous food recipes, weapons, and other forms of upgrade, Breath of the Wild is a vast ocean of content. Essentially, once you get the glider, the rest of the game is about strengthening yourself to make the final boss easier. How much time you spend doing other things is going to adversely affect how hard Calamity Ganon is, and doing all 4 Divine Beasts actually cuts his first phase's health in half. I love that kind of system since it leaves the challenge entirely up to you. Since you have to apparently fight any blights from the Divine Beasts you skipped over in Hyrule Castle, you can even try your luck underpowered against them. Me though, I took my time to enjoy the game and everything it has to offer, and I have no regrets. I enjoyed it from pretty much start to finish, and while I have my nitpicks and little issues, none of them diminished from the overall experience. If you can handle the mindset that weapons are disposable and having a lot of other conventions separate from most Zelda games, there's a ton of fun to be had here. Unlike most open world games, it not only has quantity, but quality in spades.
I was the last leader of Hyrule, a kingdom which no longer exists.
As I'm sure many of you are aware, the Zelda timeline can be quite a twisted little thing. From Ocarina of Time, it seems to be split into 3 paths. One path is where Link returns to being a child, leading to Majora's Mask and Twilight Princess. The second path is the adult timeline, where Ganondorf is resurrected and Hyrule is flooded, leading to Wind Waker, Phantom Hourglass, and Spirit Tracks. Of course, there's also a timeline where Link actually dies to Ganondorf, leading to Link to the Past in the 2 NES games. This is relevant because it seems Nintendo didn't want to have to deal with 3 different timelines anymore, and thus they all merged together into Breath of the Wild. Well, technically the Age of Calamity, since it's the prequel to Breath of the Wild, but let's take it one step at a time. Hyrule prepared itself as an army of guardians was assembled, 4 divine beasts helmed by the best of the best champions, and Link is Zelda's personal knight. However, things take a horrible turn. While they seemed to deal quite a blow on Ganon, he managed to pierce the 4 divine beasts with spears of malice that manifested incarnations of his hatred in the form of blights. They killed the champions inside each divine beast and took them over. Zelda's been fighting to keep Calamity Ganon contained for 100 years while Link, barely kept alive, was essentially healing himself. The game actually begins with Link awakening in the Shrine of Resurrection, having lost his memories and just being in his underwear without a weapon to speak of. Finding some clothes on a high-tech tablet called a Sheikah Slate, he's on his way. Soon finding an older gentleman, Link is asked to climb a tower to incorporate the region's map into a slate and then to find and complete 4 shrines in the local area. It becomes apparent that the purpose behind the 4 shrines is to train Link up a bit to be prepared for the world as it stands. Gaining the Cryonosis, Remote Bomb, Stasis, and Magnesis, as well as the 4 Spirit Orbs, Link makes his way to the Temple of Time. I don't know if the game intended for you to use the 4 orbs the older man asked for on the statue, but I did and got a heart container for it. It really doesn't matter because the old man reveals himself to be the long-lost King of Hyrule. Lamenting their previous failure, Link's task is made clear. He must face Calamity Ganon and take back Hyrule Castle, in addition to saving the princess who's been fighting to keep him contained for 100 years. As I said, after you get the glider, you can take on Calamity Ganon immediately if you're up for it. Still, what the plot wants you to do is head over to Kakariko Village and seek out Impa. She was alive 100 years ago and is understandably a bit aged. She explains the Calamity and what happened to the Divine Beasts. After being sent to the nearby Hateno Ancient Tech Lab and meeting Purah to get the camera room, there are photos already in it that Zelda took. Thus, in addition to freeing the 4 champions from their Divine Beasts, you're also encouraged to find and visit these locations so that Link can jar his memories of things that happened in the past. I won't delve into detail about the champions too much for spoilers, but each one requires you to go into a familiar territory if you played the previous games. You've got Zora's Domain, the Gorons' Death City, Rito Village, and Gyarados Desert. The Rito are perhaps the most different from previous incarnations, namely Wind Waker, as they're now mostly bipedal birds instead of mostly humanoids. In each, there's a descendant of the champion you have to basically help out in the area to pacify and gain access to each divine beast. In addition, you may also choose to get the Master Sword back, requiring traversal through the Lost Woods and having 13 hearts on you. Apparently the Master Sword has to be pulled out by someone with enough strength, and lacking the heart can quite literally kill you. There's plenty of things you can do, from side quests to upgrading things for yourself to reaching the finale, but the story itself is relatively on the simple side. Open world games tend to not have the tightest stories, and Breath of the Wild is no exception, which can be seen as a critique. It really doesn't pigeonhole you much at all, so really the story can't be that tightly wound. Still, all things considered, I think it has quite enough for itself. Essentially, the real meat of things is seeing communities still trying to rebuild, ranging from the most affected near Hyrule Castle to the outskirts that were barely affected outside of the 4 divine beasts going rogue. Ultimately, the game asks that you'll be motivated enough to want to save Princess Zelda from her ongoing struggle, defeat Calamity Ganon, and possibly free the 4 champions' souls and save Hyrule yet again. Zelda games never had the deepest stories imaginable anyway, so I thought it was all well and good. The interactions with people, especially the 4 champions, really gave context to things, and I especially found Mipha's interactions with Link to be quite heartwarming. It seems certain Zora princesses having a thing for Link might become an ongoing trend, but at least Mipha's a lot sweeter about it. I enjoyed the other 3 too, even the arrogant Rivali. What I'm saying is the plot is good and the characters are nicely varied. For an open world Zelda game, I'm more than satisfied. Breath of the Wild's graphical style seems to borrow somewhat from Wind Waker, at least for the characters. There's a very simplistic style with very hard cel-shaded shadows over them. That being said though, it would be erroneous to say it's just a Wind Waker clone, as it pumps up the detail to a level never before seen in a Zelda game. The grass especially is quite lush and all over the place, and the environment as a whole has enough detail that you could say it falls a bit on the realistic side. Now, that's not to say muted colors, of course. As you can see, the land of Hyrule is quite vivid and saturated with color, and it's quite beautiful to look at. There's also a decent variety of environments on display. Not the most original, but it's not like it has to reinvent the wheel here. You've got lush green fields, damp swamps and rivers, bitterly cold snow regions, dry hot desert, and of course Death Mountain is appropriately full of magma and rock. There's also places like a beachfront, some areas covered in disgusting ooze from Calamity Ganon, and you've got plenty of areas to breathe it all in. The draw distance is fairly massive, LODs or not, and you can see just about anywhere on the map at any one time. I praised Dark Souls 3 for a similar interconnected feeling, but this is a big open world, so it's even more pronounced here. One of my favorite moments is actually registering towers, because the camera zooms out and gives you a nice long pan of the surrounding area with accompanying heroic sounding string. This being on the Wii U and Switch, it also flexes some shaders around. Little things like refractions with the water and heat distortions, as well as bloom and most objects casting shadows, are perhaps expected by now, but still do add a lot to the world. Physics also play a huge part of the world. You can chop a tree down into a log, roll it down a hill, and have it end up in a deep enough body of water where it actually floats to the surface. You can also do things like start fires with the grass and trees, and it spreads around Far Cry 2 style. The physics on display even factors into the gameplay, since you can use cheeky methods to decimate enemy enclosures, made all the sweeter with magnesis, stasis, and a few explosive barrels conveniently in the camps. There's even a day and night cycle where you can see every casted shadow slowly bend in reaction to the sun and moon respectively. There's a number of animations that capture a variety of reactions and actions from each character, including NPC reactions to Link accidentally or not so accidentally hitting them. One hilarious thing is to wear Majora's Mask, as it fools Lizalfos, Bokoblins, and Moblins into not attacking you. Instead, they rush up to you and either start sniffing you or licking you. It's pretty funny watching them so curious about this unusual human that seems to be wearing the mask of what I can only assume is their Dark Lord or something. Naturally, these kind of reactions extend especially well to NPCs, and you can really identify with each scene as you see their expressions. This is also helped by the fact that key NPCs even have voice acting, something not seen in Zelda since the horrific CDI days, not counting little things like "Come on" from Wind Waker. I'd best describe the voice acting as pretty good. It's not Oscar-worthy or anything, but it's hardly the laughable tier voice acting in the CDI game of the cartoon. I'd maybe compare it to Kid Icarus Uprising. It's well enough, and I was able to connect to the characters. As I mentioned, I especially became connected to Mipha, although all 4 champions and Zelda herself are fully voiced and fit very well with their personalities. Sadly though, most of the NPCs remain unvoiced. Even certain ones like Impa and Sidon will have rare instances of voice acting that are otherwise mostly text. Don't get me wrong, I get it, voice acting is a bit expensive and time consuming, but it's still a shame we don't get to hear more. At least what we do hear is pretty good. Breath of the Wild's music is overall more subdued than other entries in the series, at least in the overworld. In select places like the Divine Beast, towns, and shrines, there's more prominent music, of course. Piano is largely used in many of the themes, most notably in the frantic theme that plays when a guardian spots you in the wild. I best describe that as having a similar feeling to the SAX theme for Metroid Fusion, and that feeling is get out of there fast. One thing I didn't even notice until several people, notably a Tumblr account named AskLink the Hylian Champion, pointed out is that there's actually Morse code for SOS the Divine Beast's initial themes. The theme for Rivali's Beast is actually delayed with its SOS, but it comes in more clearly without being scrambled by other codes, befitting of his arrogant personality to wait until he knows he has no hope of winning. Honestly, when I heard that, it was pretty heart-sinking knowing their Divine Beasts were signaling help for 100 years and only now is help arriving. Even once you activate the terminals in the Divine Beast and the music shifts up a gear, it on its own can be quite dramatic. It really gives you a good feel of the helplessness they must have felt. Onto a brighter subject, areas like Zora's Domain and Rito Village really call upon their counterparts in earlier games with their music, and it's all a joy to listen to. Another welcomed earworm is hearing Cass's theme. He's a Rito you'll sometimes run into, playing his signature accordion and can be identified by the music. I love listening to it. As always, I'm not exactly one to turn to for deep sound effects analysis, as it sounds simply fine to me. That being said, the ambiance all over the overworld with the more sedated music generally really wrapped me up in the world. Affirmation sounds like the sonar beep for the enhanced camera rune and the unpleasant sound of the Guardian charging up its laser certainly fit perfectly well, as do the fanfares all throughout. Basically, Breath of the Wild looks and sounds quite spectacular. If I'm being honest, part of me wants to see Nintendo attempt a more realistic styled Zelda game like Twilight Princess, but with HD generation hardware in mind. That being said, that's not a blight against Breath of the Wild, far from it excels in its own little style, and I wouldn't blame Nintendo if they wanted to keep pursuing this style. It doesn't go as far as Wind Waker, but it's also a little more cartoony, at least in its characters, than something like Skyward Sword. It achieves a fine balance and manages to look quite good on all fronts. You can tell a lot of love and care was taken into crafting the world to really make it come alive. Unlike most open-world games that seem like they're only really being made open-world to fulfill a quota, Breath of the Wild doesn't really feel stretched. The land of Hyrule is quite varied and lush, and I probably won't tire of exploring it. As I mentioned in the opening of this review, I was wrong when I expected Breath of the Wild to be a pretty good Zelda game. The reason why is because I never thought I'd be so engrossed in this game. As both a Zelda game and an open world game, it truly excels in most categories. It's hardly perfect, but it was an excellent adventure from start to finish. Whether it's exploring new territory or delving deeper into the lore and characters that make up the world, it certainly kept me wanting for more. If you like the Zelda games or just open world games in general, you owe it to yourself to give this game a spin. You might end up being pleasantly surprised the same way I was, enough so that Breath of the Wild is now my favorite Zelda game. This has been my review of The Legend of Zelda Breath of the Wild. Thank you so much for tuning in with me. Now go grab your Master Sword, hop in your Divine Beast motorcycle, and put the pedal to the metal all over Ganon's ugly mug. Born to be wild, baby.